Hello. Last lecture we had in class, we wrapped up with the passage in ratification of the 15th Amendment, and here we will pick up with women and Reconstruction. So, without further ado, let's get going here. So, um, as it pertains to women and Reconstruction, remember that before the Civil War, uh, the women's rights movement and the abolition movement were parallel movements. There was a lot of overlap in leadership between the two, and both movements were advocating for each other's movements. Uh, so the women's rights movement that started before the Civil War kind of gets put on the back burner uh, during the war, but then after the war, it is reignited. The American Equal Rights Association is formed. This is the National Women's Rights Convention and the Anti-Slavery Society joined together in to make that organization. The organization argued for universal suffrage, not just African American suffrage. And this brought a lot of controversy. Some advocates argued for universal suffrage before just black suffrage, while others like Frederick Douglass argued suffrage for Black Americans in the South was a matter of life or death. Most of these movements were in the North, as you know, many of these, any type of rights movement in that day tended to be geographically in the North. A couple names to be aware of in terms of leadership in the women's rights movement. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are two of the most recognized leaders in the women's rights movement who met before the Civil War. Stanton was responsible for organizing the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which was the first women's rights convention in the United States. At the convention, she suggested women should have the right to vote. People at the convention thought she was going too far, but it soon became part of the women's rights movement. Anthony and Stanton felt that the AERA only concentrated on black suffrage, not universal suffrage, after the Civil War, and they argued that the Constitution already gave women the right to vote. They told women to go vote between 1868 and 1872. About 700 women illegally voted. Anthony was eventually arrested, but later acquitted. And in 1875, the Supreme Court said women had citizenship, but not the right to vote. All right, our next topic on Reconstruction is racial violence during Reconstruction. The South had been built on slavery, both economically and its social structure, and many white Southerners refused to accept black free labor. What we mean by black free labor is not enslaved labor. So please don't get free labor confused with unpaid labor. All right, the Ku Klux Klan terrorized Black Americans and Republicans at voting polls, workplaces, and their homes. The KKK started in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee. By 1868, had spread to every state in the South. There were other white terror groups, for example, the White League, the Night Riders, the Bushwhackers, the Knights of White Camellia, the White Brotherhood, and they often operated at night. Um, many, if you think of a small town, this might be a situation where you have the local police officers or sheriff's deputies who are members of these terror groups, local politicians, business owners. So operating at night provided some type of cover for their identities. Some of the things that these groups engaged in: riots against black political authority, many examples of violence towards black people during the Reconstruction period. In 1886, the New Orleans 1866 rather, during the New Orleans massacre, uh, blacks who were protesting black codes were attacked by a mob, and 38 were killed. And then lynch mobs became common during this time period as well. as public lynchings started to increase. In 1870 to 1871, the federal government passed what was called the Enforcement Acts, making it illegal to deny black people their civil rights. This was an attempt to stop KKK violence, uh, but KKK violence would end up continuing. White Southerners argued that the white violence was exaggerated and or fabricated, and white terrorism ended federal involvement in Reconstruction and replaced it with racial repression at the conclusion of Reconstruction. Now, the economy weighs quite heavily during the war. Economically, during the war, the North had industry, infrastructure, and financial markets that grew. During the war, the U.S. government raised tariffs, passed the first national income tax, and created the first flat tax. The first fiat currency, the greenback currency. What we mean by fiat currency is paper currency not based on the gold standard. And business increased during the war, but there was some pretty significant inflation, which made that greenback currency not too valuable in the long run. In the South, um, you know, the South was wealthy from cotton production before the war, but it was cut off from selling cotton during the war. Remember, that was part of the Union strategy, part of the Anaconda Plan. And then the South could not import other supplies, food, or guns. The South had some industry, but significantly less than the North. Now, economic development in the South during Reconstruction. The South was in ruins. White planters lost most of their wealth. Cotton is still important, but there was starting to become more competition in the world. Large plantations turned into small plots of land and redistributed or sold off. There's a movement from slave labor to free labor, obviously with the abolition of slavery. But extra legal violence was used to keep African American citizens bounded by labor through the labor contracts and the black codes. And there's deep poverty in the South that would exist up until the 1930s. And again, there's the use of extra legal violence to keep Black Americans bound by labor. Once again, we got to remember it's through legal loopholes, is what we mean here by extra legal. Which brings us to sharecropping. So sharecropping became the predominant way for plantation owners to get labor. So poor black and white farmers earned a living from land owned by someone else. Uh, they worked independently, growing cotton, tobacco, rice, sugar, and various other crops. The landowner provided the land, the housing, tools, seed, possibly a mule or a horse, whatever was needed. And then the merchant provided other supplies sold on credit. At harvest time, the sharecropper received a certain percentage of the output and used part of their earning to pay off debt to the merchant. So this system kind of kept sharecroppers in a perpetual state of debt as they would get less and less for their crops as they were accumulating debt, having to pay rent on land, on housing, on tools, all of it. So this practice became widespread in the South during Reconstruction, and this is what resulted in large plantations being divided into smaller plots of land. This process of sharecropping lasted into the mid 1900s. In fact, the photo you see on the screen is from 1941. So again, this is not ancient history. Now, as we move into the end of Reconstruction, we're going to take a look at various reasons why Reconstruction ended the way it did. So when the North abandoned the cause of Black Americans in the South and Democrats took control, in the South, Reconstruction would quickly come to an end. Focus of economy over Reconstruction would take place in the 1870s, especially after the Panic of 1873. And the only thing that kept Reconstruction going was the military presence in the South. There was enough officials in the South to enforce the 14th Amendment, the election of 1876, and the resulting compromise of 1877 would officially end Reconstruction. Now, looking at some of the groups involved in the process for the end of Reconstruction, we have who are referred to as redeemers. These are Democrats who distanced themselves from pro-slavery Democrats. Redeemers were just Democrats that concentrated on business, economics, and trade rather than pro-slavery. So really what you're seeing here is a shift in ideology of the Democratic Party in the South in particular, but also in the North. Redeemers won support in the South by promising local rule by white Democrats, not white Republicans or African Americans. And they helped to pave the way for the Democrats to recontrol the South. By 1871, Redeemers had control in Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia. Now, I mentioned the Panic of 1873 as being another cause for the end of Reconstruction. This is an economic depression that lasted for 4 years. It's often referred to as the Great Depression until 1929, when we had a Great Depression, which we now know as the Great Depression. But during this panic, this economic depression, wages plummeted, uh, debt-trapped workers in an endless cycle of poverty because they're just constantly working to pay off debt and never getting ahead of it. This helped Democrats gain control during the midterm election in the election of 1874, and this would make it difficult to continue Reconstruction. It made the economy the focus and not Reconstruction the focus. And then comes the election of 1876, where we have Republican Rutherford B. Hayes versus Samuel Tilden, the Democrat. Um, this is the most disputed election in American history. This is similar to, at this point, this is similar to the corrupt bargain between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Tilden won 19 more electoral votes, but 20 electoral votes from 4 states were disputed. There was a special electoral commission uh, selected to choose the president, made up of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats. Naturally, Rutherford B. Hayes was selected by the commission because there were more Republicans. The Democrats were furious. They threatened to boycott the inauguration and create a rival government, recognizing Samuel Tilden as president. And many people feared that this was going to lead to a new civil war. So a compromise was made to avoid further disputes. And we know that now as the Compromise of 1877. In this compromise, Democrats conceded the election to Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Republicans agreed that they would take the troops out of the South. And this would ultimately be the official end of Reconstruction. Democrats in the South had no fear of troops and could intimidate black voters with no resistance. And after 1877, Republicans did not have the will to intervene in the South. Segregation in the South would become common law, and it would be so until the 1950s when the Civil Rights Movement began. So, just final thoughts here on Reconstruction. Reconstruction introduced the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. While there's a significant number of shortcomings with Reconstruction, just the way it played out, it was a significant era in American history that helped develop civil rights in the United States. And of course, the United States was restored in terms of the states that had seceded being brought back into the Union. All right, so that is a wrap on some basic information on Reconstruction. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me or ask in class. And enjoy your snow day and long weekend. Take care.